Mental asylums during the Victorian era are definitely not your modern day rehab center. These places were like the catch-all bucket for anyone society didn't quite know how to handle, not just for those grappling with mental illness, but also for people who just didn't fit the very tight Victorian mold. Got a rebellious streak, or just too loud for your neighbor's liking? You might just find yourself locked up in one of these gloomy asylums. And let me tell you, the conditions were nothing short of nightmarish. We're talking about overcrowding, minimal if any real mental health treatment, and methods of confinement that could make even the sanest person question their sanity. It was less about healing and more about hiding away the problematic ones out of society's sight. Imagine being treated more like a prisoner in a dungeon than a patient in a hospital. That was the harsh reality of Victorian mental asylums. Next up on our list today, we have peine forte et dure. Imagine being accused of a crime in the not so good old days, and there you are, stubbornly refusing to plead guilty or not guilty because you know the system is rigged. Enter the nightmare fuel of the medieval world. This gruesome punishment method was something straight out of a horror flick. The accused would be laid flat and a board would be placed on top of their chest. Then stones, cold, heavy stones, are piled onto the board one by one. The weight increases, the breathing gets harder, and why endure such torture? It's all because of a loophole. By not pleading guilty or not guilty, the accused could avoid a formal trial, which meant even if they died under the weight, their family could still inherit their stuff. It was a brutal, desperate gamble. Though officially scrapped just before the Victorian era kicked in, the sheer horror of this punishment lingered in the public memory, kind of like the ghost of punishments past whispering, "Be glad you live in the now." Next up, we are journeying over to the gibbet. The gibbet, or gibbeting, was like a horror movie of old school punishments. So picture this. After the execution took place, the criminal wasn't just buried and forgotten about. No, that would just be too easy, I guess. Their body instead was sometimes locked up in an iron cage and hung from a tall frame called a gibbet, kind of like a creepy bird cage, but for humans. This wasn't tucked away in some dark corner either. It was of course out in the open where everyone could see it. The body was left to hang there, decomposing in the open air come rain or shine. Why the public display? Well, it was all about scare tactics. The sight of a swinging, decaying corpse was supposed to frighten anyone from thinking about breaking the law. Fair enough. It was a very stark, gruesome reminder plastered right in the town square. Break the law and you could be the next ghastly attraction. Yikes. Talk about a deterrent. I don't think I'd commit any crime after that, actually. It's crazy. Even just like Scared Straight or whatever that show is, like that was enough for me. Just a real dead body hanging in the middle of the town square. So scary. Okay. I don't think I'd do well in the Victorian era, but I guess they wouldn't do well now. Imagine showing like TikTok to a Victorian child. Next up on our list today, we are talking about hulks. Before dedicated prisons became widespread, hulks were a common form of punishment. At first, hulks sounds more like something from like a pirate adventure than real life, but trust me, it was far from a swashbuckling good time. Before the days of modern prisons, these old creaky warships, stripped of their glory and no longer seaworthy, were anchored permanently in harbors to house prisoners. Imagine being crammed into the dank, dark belly of a decommissioned ship with scores of other unfortunate souls. Conditions on these floating prisons were nothing short of nightmarish. They were overcrowded, they were festering with disease, and the air was thick with despair. Prisoners were often put to back-breaking work during the day, maybe hammering away at shipbreaking or toiling in nearby docks or riverbanks, and life on a hull was just a grim, a slow, and a steady descent into misery, making it one of the punishments from the past that was as much about enduring harsh conditions as it was about serving time. Next up on our list today, we have shame. Public humiliation was a go-to tactic in the punishment playbook during the Victorian era, and honestly even before that. Imagine being caught for a petty theft or you're a public nuisance, and instead of just serving time or getting a ticket, you're slapped with a giant sign spelling out your crime, and then you are paraded around town. Or perhaps you'll find yourself locked in the stocks, stuck in one uncomfortable position in the town square. Here, everyone from cheeky kids to stern old-timers could get a good look at you, and they didn't just stare. Of course not. They jeered, they tossed rotten tomatoes, or worse, sometimes. It wasn't just about making you rethink your life choices, it was about showing everyone else what could happen if they stepped out of line. This kind of punishment turned lawbreakers into live lessons in morality, with a side of entertainment Victorian style. Kinda makes you glad that all you get is a parking ticket these days, right? I'm just saying, alright? Put that in the gratitude journal this morning. Next up on our list today, we have the drunkard's cloak. Speaking of shame, this was one method that definitely worked to embarrass anyone out of committing this crime, and it also showed that maybe the Victorians had a bit of a sense of humor, although a very morbid one. So imagine you're in a bustling town square and there's someone looking quite ridiculous and moving awkwardly among the crowd. This poor soul is decked out in the infamous drunkard's cloak, which is basically a barrel turned into a heavy, uncomfortable garment. Think of it as the original cone of shame, but for humans. This barrel, often with holes for the arms and head, turned public drunks into walking spectacles. Walking around in this bulky, clunky barrel made any movement a challenge and attracted all kinds of stares, snickers, and maybe even a few rotten tomatoes from onlookers. This cloak wasn't just a punishment, it was a public statement. I partied too hard, and look where it got me. Designed to shame the wearer and entertain the public, the drunkard's cloak was a bizarre blend of punishment and street theater. So next time you're thinking about overdoing it at happy hour, just be thankful you're not doing so in a time when the hangover could involve navigating the local market in a barrel. That would be horrible. Alright, next up on our list we have flogging. Spare the rod and spoil the child. If you've heard this phrase before, imagine it being taken to the extreme, as they often did in the Victorian era. Flogging wasn't just a quick slap on the wrist, it was a full-on event with the person typically tied up and given a set number of lashes that could leave scars for life. This punishment wasn't exclusive to hardened criminals. Oh no, even some of the more vulnerable members of our communities could get a taste of the whip for acting up. And soldiers or sailors might find themselves on the receiving end for stepping out of line. The idea was that a good thrashing could correct any number of moral or disciplinary issues. Sounds pretty harsh, right? Well, that was Victorian justice for you. Very much about making the punishment fit the crime with a side of public humiliation to ensure you'd think twice before stepping out of line again. Next up on our list today we have the debtor's prison. Imagine a world where you've just run out of luck with your finances and bam, you're sent off to a debtor's prison, which is about as fun as it sounds. So, not fun at all. These places were grim. Think of the worst hotel you've ever seen, then remove any windows, heating, or good food. In debtor's prison, you were stuck until your debt was paid off, but here's where things get even more interesting. How in the world are you supposed to settle your debts when you're locked up and you can't work? It's kind of like trying to run a marathon with your legs tied together. Meanwhile, your family on the outside, yeah, forgot about them, they're just scrambling to get by without their main money earner, which often plunged them into their own financial crisis. Love that. It was just a vicious cycle that didn't do much for actually solving the problem of debt. Instead, it just added a hefty dose of misery and despair to the mix. It sounds like the Victorian era was actually just a lot of that. Misery and despair. So next time you're fretting about paying bills, just be thankful you're not doing it Victorian style, I guess. Or else I'd be in Rogers prison for my phone bill. Next up we have the scold's bridle. Back in the Victorian era, if a woman was labeled a bit too chatty or opinionated, heaven forbid she actually nag, she might find herself in the not so stylish accessory known as the scold's bridle. Imagine a heavy, clunky metal mask clamping over your head, complete with a gag right in your mouth to put the kibosh on any further chit chat. Okay, not exactly the pinnacle of fashion or comfort, right? This contraption wasn't just about silencing, it was the 19th century version of public shaming with a generous dash of misogyny. Women were paraded around, their speech literally bridled as a warning to others that speaking out of turn wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Thankfully, we've relegated such barbaric practices to the history books, but the scold's bridle remains a stark reminder of how far we've come in understanding and respecting individual rights and voices. Moving on down our list, we are talking about transportation next. Imagine you're living in 19th century Britain and things are frankly pretty bleak if you're not wearing a top hat and tails. Now imagine you've been caught stealing a loaf of bread or, heaven forbid, a handkerchief. The punishment? Well, you're not just going to the local jail, you're being shipped off to the other side of the world. Transportation meant being packed off to Australia or Tasmania, places that were as remote and alien as the moon for many Brits at the time. These were no pleasure cruises. The journey alone could take months on cramped, disease-ridden ships where survival was a coin toss. Once you arrived, if you were still kicking, congratulations! Your prize was hard labor in brutal conditions, often in chain gangs or remote outposts where the sun seemed to have a personal vendetta against you. And forget about a leisurely pint at the pub, you were there to work, building the infrastructure for new colonies, often in sweltering heat or other extreme conditions. Speaking of hard labor, the good old Victorian era where they took no pain, no gain to a whole new level, especially in prisons. So imagine you've been nabbed for stealing a loaf of bread, and yes, this is the only example I will be using like I'm Jean Valjean himself. So imagine you stole the bread and bam, you're sentenced to hard labor. And we're not talking about breaking a sweat at the gym, we're diving into the world of the treadmill and the crank machine. Victorian style gym equipment from your worst nightmare. Imagine being stuck on a never-ending stairmaster, the treadmill, not for your health, but as punishment, climbing to nowhere for hours. Then there's the crank machine, a mind-numbing device that had prisoners turn a crank a mind-blowing number of times just to complete their daily quota. And for what? Absolutely nothing. No purpose, no product, just pure fatigue and despair. It was the era's twisted way of teaching a lesson, breaking spirits under the guise of building character. So next time you moan about your gym routine, just remember it could have been a Victorian prison workout, alright? It's not so bad. You got this. Just a couple more flights of stairs. I don't know, I'm turning into David Goggins here. Almost called him Jimmy Goggins for some reason. I don't know where that came from. Okay, anyways. Next up on our list we have the pillory and stocks. Oh, the pillory and stocks. Imagine you're walking down the street in Victorian times and there's someone's head and hands locked up, sticking out of a wooden frame. Definitely quite the sight. This was the era's version of trending on social media, but instead of likes and shares, you get rotten tomatoes to the face. The poor folks caught in these contraptions were there for everyone to see, often in the town square, serving as a living warning against misbehaving. Passerbys weren't shy about expressing their opinions either. They'd hurl anything from spoiled veggies to less savory items, making sure the punished got their share of public scorn. It wasn't just about the physical discomfort, which was definitely no picnic, mind you, but the real kicker was the embarrassment. Imagine being the center of negative attention with every local and their dog coming out to see you as the day's unfortunate spectacle. Definitely not the kind of fame anyone would want. Also, there was like 10 people alive at this time. Everyone knows your business now. How embarrassing. Next up, let's dive into the eerie world of solitary confinement, Victorian style. Perhaps an even more miserable twist on a punishment that still exists today. You're locked up all by yourself in a tiny, gloomy cell with nobody to chat with but the spiders weaving their webs in the corner. Definitely not as nice as Charlotte. This was the reality for prisoners in the separate system, notably at places like the Eastern State Penitentiary in the US and Pentonville Prison in the UK. The idea was kind of like a forced meditation retreat minus the zen and the tranquility. They thought making prisoners sit alone with their thoughts thoughts would lead to soul searching and moral reform. And this sounds very noble, of course, but in practice, it turned out to be more like a recipe for a mental breakdown. The isolation was so intense that many inmates ended up more losing their minds than reaching enlightenment. While it was all the rage back in the day, we now do know that too much alone time, especially in a dreary cell, can do more harm than good. Next up today, we are diving into the world of branding. It's the early Victorian era, a time when top hats were all the rage, and so, unfortunately, was branding people. Yes, you heard that right. Back in those days, if you were a soldier or a sailor who tried to ditch your duties or got caught doing something naughty, you might end up with a hot iron pressed against your skin. Ouch! Now, this wasn't your subtle, hide it under your shirt kind of mark. We're talking about a blazing hot iron stamping a symbol on your face, your hand, or anywhere that it would be visible. The idea was to not just punish, but to label you as a wrongdoer for everyone to see. It was kind of like walking around with a "I made a big oopsie" sign etched on your skin. This brutal calling card did more than just sting and leave a scar. It messed up how people saw you, and it slashed your chances of getting decent work. In a world without second chances, this was a harsh way to learn a lesson. So next time you think about skipping out on your duties, remember that in history, that might have ended up with you quite literally being branded for life. And finally on our list today we have public whipping. I've definitely learned that during the Victorian era they liked all the craziest things to be a public spectacle. So imagine you're walking through a Victorian era town square and suddenly there's a crowd gathering. Something's going down and it's not the local fair, it's a public whipping. So some poor soul, shirt ripped off, is tied to a post right in the center of the action. The whip cracks, and it's not just the sound that sends shivers down your spine, it's the whole thing. People are watching, some with horror, others with a kind of grim satisfaction, as each lash marks the offender's back. The idea? It's not just about the pain, which is definitely plenty, but it's also about the embarrassment of being the day's main entertainment. Getting whipped in front of your neighbors, or worse, your family, is like adding a massive scoop of shame to your pain Sunday. Victorian society was big on moral lessons, and public whipping was like a live-action cautionary tale, saying break the rules and this could be you. Kinda puts a whole new spin on the idea of a public spectacle, doesn't it?
Number 10. Treadmill punishment. While getting on a treadmill today can feel like a punishment in itself, back in the Victorian era, prisoners were assigned to the treadmill as a real punishment. Yeah, you can't get off this one. You would think they're only making prisoners stronger, but there is a method behind this madness. Listen up. The treadmill was invented by Sir William Cubitt in 1818. The treadmill was used not only for grinding corn, but mainly as a punishment. Corn and punishments, my two favorite things. Prisoners would step on 24 spokes of a large paddle wheel, causing it to turn. While originally intended for productive work, it quickly became a form of punishment. Yeah, somebody saw it and was like, you know what? I know how to make this awful. Get on there. The repetitive physical strain of the treadmill made it one of the most dreaded among inmates. Just thinking about a treadmill right now is making my legs shake. Let's move on. Number 9. Amelia Dyer. During the Victorian era, rapid industrialization led to urban expansion, bringing with it increased disease, poverty, and unemployment. All those fun things that make a city. By 1856, the force had expanded to include inspectors tasked with investigating serious crimes. One notable event occurred in 1896 when reading detectives apprehended Amelia Dyer. She was convicted of multiple killings, the worst of the worst, the details of which I can't even say on YouTube or else our channel will get shut down. But the number of lives Amelia Dyer has taken, historians believe that number is around 400. 400, and a lot of them are quite young, by the way. Quite young. If it weren't for the Readingborough police force and that small team of officers, who knows how many more lives would have been lost by the hands of one Amelia Dyer. 8. Transportation. In the 1800s, courts were looking for alternatives to hanging that were harsher than fines, but not as brutal as, well, being hanged. Transportation then emerged as a viable punitive option. Initiated in 1717, this practice involved sending convicts away, just sending them away to colonies, primarily in Australia at the time, where over 165,000 were transported over 80 years. Now, initially, convicts were housed on decrepit warships with a high mortality rate, of course due to unsanitary conditions, but the majority of those transported were male, ranging from quite young again, very young, to individuals that were over 80. It could be anyone. These boats were crazy. The journey often included stops in Gibraltar, the West Indies, South America, or the Cape of Good Hope to resupply provisions before reaching various Australian settlements. To which they go, you, get out. Okay, let's do it. Number 7, the crank. Oh, the crank. It sounds easy, but you give it time. Prisoners often endured hard labor such as breaking stones or turning the crank machine, which was a handle that convicts had to turn thousands of times a day, and often for no purpose other than punishment. Yeah, it's like a wheel that'll, not a wheel, it's like a, this is a blooper, me going, it's like a, it's like those old cars where you had to roll the window down manually. It took you like 7.5 minutes. You're like, come on, I'm so hot. There we go, we found it. An example is the case of Oscar Wilde, who was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency. Now, his prison experience, especially the hard labor, drastically affected his health and literary productivity. So far, this one here sounds the worst. At least with the treadmill, you got a little bit stronger over time. There's some sort of payoff. But turning a crank for no reason at all, I mean, maybe your one arm would get jacked, but other than that, you're just gonna destroy your body for no reason at all. What a nightmare. The scold's bridle was a sinister instrument of public humiliation from the Victorian era. Now this one really sucked, I'm not gonna lie. We're gonna start cranking it up here, no pun intended. The device was used to punish unruly women who were accused of nagging or gossiping. Yeah, you talk to your friend, now you're at the scold's bridle. Enjoy. The scold's bridle resembled an iron cage almost. The bridle enclosed the head of the accused, while some versions featured a spiked or studded plate that was inserted into the mouth to suppress speech and causing, of course, excruciating pain if the wearer attempted to continue to gossip or talk. They were often paraded through the streets and the victim was subjected to public ridicule and scorn. Yeah, scorn. You ever been scorned before? That sucks. Turning the scold's bridle into a dreadful symbol of enforced silence and societal control over women's voices and opinions. This one looks like a saw trap too. This was pretty brutal. It should have been number 1 if anything. Number 5, solitary confinement. You're grounded. And I really mean you're grounded. In the Victorian era, solitary confinement was a widely utilized form of punishment that embodied the period's harsh philosophy. Yeah, we're not cranking things. This time we're just thinking about our problems. It was known originally as the separate system, and it was designed to isolate prisoners to reflect on their crimes and ideally reform. Rather, they just went absolutely insane. Inmates were confined in small, stark cells, cut off from all human contact and external stimuli. No sunlight, no hope, nothing. The silence and isolation were intended to prevent the corruption associated with the prisoner interaction, and of course encourage penitence, right? You wanna behave, of course. However, this extreme isolation often led to severe psychological effects, if anything, including mental breakdowns. I'd have a breakdown on day 2, are you kidding me? I thought getting grounded as a kid was bad, but at least then I could see the sun, so not half bad considering what it used to be.
Stand your ground until you can't anymore. The neck tower. This torture and execution was done in 2 ways. Either in a tall, narrow tower or in a tall wooden frame box. Either way, both tower or box could open only from the bottom side. A prisoner is put inside the wooden box frame or tower with only the neck protruding. Hands and feet would be shackled inside and only a towering pile of stones would be in there to stand on. However, each day, a stone or 2 is removed, dropping the prisoner lower and lower and lower by inches over the days, letting them die slowly by strangulation. Battle of the sexes with this torture, it's zanzi, a form of crushing torture used to extract confessions or as a penalization for laws broken. Now may be a fun time to mention that the 5 laws of punishment I had just counted for you guys, those punishments actually only apply to men. For women, the 5 punishments are a different set and far less severe. First is grind and grain, second is the zanzi, which you're about to learn about, third punishment is beating, fourth is confinement, but also sometimes, as mentioned, she got her womb smacked about a little, and finally 5, permission to take your own life. Not them killing you or telling you to do, no. This was some like side eye, well, we're not telling you what to do, but you know what's up, ... type of thing. Anyways, the zanzi. This finger crusher was a Chinese instrument of torture consisting of small sticks strung together with cords, which was then placed around the fingers and ground gradually pulled, causing agonizing pain inwards. Think being tricked into playing knuckle breaker by your older brother for the first time? Under traditional Chinese law, a person could not be convicted of a crime unless they confessed. The zanzi was a legal and non-lethal torture method for forcing women to confess, and for men there was a similar and more painful jiagun ankle crusher, which uses 3-yard-long wooden planks that slowly pulled and compressed the feet in an excruciating fashion that both broke tendon and bone. Time to snatch that waist ancient China style, the waist chop. Waist chopping first appeared in the Zhou dynasty, and sadly no, it was not truly a plastic surgery alternative to get that slim thick summer look going. In reality, it's when a prisoner is tied to a table, whether lengthwise or widthwise, it doesn't matter. However, it's definitely far less comfortable to be chopped in half while also awkwardly dangling your arms and legs off of a table. Anyways, lying face down, the executioner was to try being the key word, to sever the person in half using a large fodder knife at the small of the back. These big ass knives were literally so heavy, it was more like teetering forward and letting the blade kinda slam into the person and hoping for the best. Sometimes, most times, the chopping was not limited to one blow. A story from 1734 describes Yu Hongtu, the education administrator of Henan, was sentenced to a waist chop. After being cut in two at the waist, he remained alive long enough to write the Chinese character Chen, which means cruel, 7 times with his own blood before dying. After hearing this, the young Zheng emperor abolished this form of execution. I guess maybe after learning what happened to Hongtu, the emperor felt like half the man he used to be too. Huh? Yeah? We've heard of it before, we'll hear of it again. It's Ling Chi, aka slow slicing, a regular torture and execution to reoccur in BumbleBee videos due to how far spread this torture traveled, how much it was used, and just how overall disturbing it is. Slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of torture and execution used in China from roughly 900 CE up until the practice ended around the early 1900s. The process involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame, usually in a public place. The flesh was then cut from the body in multiple slices in a process that was not specified in detail in Chinese law and therefore likely varied per empire or century. Generally, it consists of cuts to the arms, then the legs and chest, leading to the amputation of the limbs, followed by decapitation or a stab to the heart. If the criminal was less serious or the executioner more merciful, the first cut would be to the throat. The punishment worked on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and lingering death, and as a punishment after death. To be cut into pieces meant that the body of the victim was not whole in the spiritual life after death, which is massively consequential to many Chinese people who believed reincarnation required being whole in death. It is described as a fast process lasting no longer than 15 to 20 minutes. The coup de grace was all the more certain when the family could afford a bribe to have the stab to the heart inflicted first. Some emperors ordered 3 days of cutting, while others may have ordered specific tortures before the execution for a longer execution. For example, records show that during Yan Chouhan's execution, Yan was heard shouting for half a day before his death. And finally, the 9 degrees of punishment are 10 shades of effed up. In the words of Mulan's Mushu, alright, that's it. Dishonor, dishonor on your whole family, make a note of this, dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow. Well, the Qin dynasty and a few others of China really felt this sentiment with their whole chests, and it shows in the creation of the 9 degrees. See, the punishment involved the execution of close and extended family members. These included the criminal's living parents, the criminal's living grandparents, any children the criminal may have over a certain age, which varied depending on the time period and who was in control and what their definition of a child even was. Also siblings and siblings-in-laws, uncles of the criminal as well as their spouses, and of course the criminal himself. Imagine messing up so bad your whole family line just gets annihilated. We all have that cousin or sibling who would have screwed all of us by now if this still happened. A famous documentation of the 9 degrees is the story of Fang, a Confucian scholar famous for his loyalty to the emperor Zhou. When the emperor is usurped and Fang is asked by the new one to write an inaugural address, well, Fang refuses. It's also ancient China, so realistically he knows exactly what refusal means, so that proves how metal his decision was. Even when threatened with family extermination, Fang showed his IDGAF attitude and is reported saying, never mind 9 agnates, go ahead with 10 10. Blowing steam out the ears, the emperor says, bet. And so Fang becomes perhaps the only case of extermination of 10 agnates in the history of China. So quite literally, in addition to his own execution, the blood relations from all 9 branches of his family hierarchy were killed. And as a kick to the nuts, his students and peers were added to be the 10th group. Random people unrelated to him who just happened to attend his lectures or work with the guy. Although altogether 873 people are said to have been executed. Because this guy refused to write a speech and when threatened said, "Do it bro, I dare you." Before death, Fang was forced to watch his brother's execution, and then Fang himself was executed by waist cutting. And legend goes that prior to his death, he dipped his finger in his own blood and wrote on the ground the Chinese character Quan, which means usurper. Man was petty until the end and took 873 people with him to prove it. Also, they liked writing in blood a lot. Is the elephant. Those same guys that you watch paint at the zoo or roll around in the mud are the same hardcore MFs that used to be weapons of war in South and Southeast Asia. While elephants were no strangers to the battlefields, they were a common capital punishment method as well, called the gungoreo, as they were smart and easily trainable. They could be used to crush, dismember, or overall torment captives in very public death sentences. The earliest record of death via elephant dates back to the classical period. However, the practice was already well established by that time and continued well into the 19th century. The most common way that the execution by elephant was carried out was the obvious: crush its victim to death with brute force. But elephants were even sometimes used in a kind of trial by ordeal where the condemned prisoner is released if he manages to fend off the elephant for long enough. The Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great is said to have used this technique to chastise rebels, and then in the end, the prisoners, presumably much chastened, were given their lives. So this obviously tells you that aside from enemy soldiers, civilians who commit certain crimes could also be punished in this brutal way. These crimes included theft, tax evasion, heresy, and rebellion. During the expedition to central India in 1868, Louis Rousselet, a French writer, photographer, and traveler, described a death sentence of a criminal by elephant. The sketch was made of the event showing the condemned being forced and placing his head on a pedestal, and then being held there, while the elephant foot crushed his head. Yeah. So, punishment number 9 is branding, a global classic. Who in the ancient world wasn't branded B-words for doing stuff they didn't want them to do? Now, in Euro nations, it was usually women or servant workers getting marked up, but in India, it was also a punishment for things other than being caught with your pants down, literally. See, how they liked to do it was the culprit was branded with a hot iron, smack dab in the center of their forehead with the words describing the offense. If you stole eggs, they will brand "stole eggs" on your face, which is equally hilarious and embarrassing. So I guess the shame part would really actually work there, especially because this branding punishment always came with a reduction of social class too. This method was commonly used in classical societies. In India it was practiced during the Mughal rule, and it since has been completely abolished. Punishment number 8 is pillory. This device was shared between a few nations. The Europeans loved this crap and used it on women constantly. As you may know from the BumbleBee videos, top 10 spine-chilling ways women were punished in medieval times, part 1 and 2. If you haven't seen those, maybe go check them out on our channel and subscribe to the Hive while you're at it so you don't miss out on anything else. In pillory, the offender was compelled to stand in a public place with his head and hands locked in the iron frame so that he couldn't move. Uncomfortably hunched over, the victim would then have his ears nailed to the pillory through the top cartilage, so his head is forced up on an angle, adding to the uncomfortable position of the spine. It would essentially be like this. Then finally, the victim would be whipped, branded, or stoned. However, if the victim was super hella dangerous, I don't know, maybe he was like a top soldier, turned evil, but had really good battle skills, and they had to be concerned about that, they'd use the pillory just to restrain him while they physically nailed the guy's actual body to a wall, then stoned them. This was practiced till the 19th century. Punishment number 7 is lost limbs. In other words, it means damaging a person severely, especially by removing a part of the body. It's another classic amongst the medieval societies, and like others who like to cut limbs off as punishment, it was usually the nose, ears, hand, or feet in India. Whatever the crime was determined the limb lost. During that period, one or both of the hands of a person were chopped off if the offender committed theft. If he indulged in intercourse offenses, such as violating someone, his his privates were cut off. That one still happens nowadays, just usually once the prisoner is already in jail. Not done by the government. Anyways, back to it. If he told a lie or criticized God, his tongue would be cut off, and if he was deceitful or untrustworthy, his ears were cut off. Punishment number 6 is brain ablaze. So, in ancient India, it turns out another fun punishment was to have certain parts, but only parts, of your body set on fire. This punishment came in alongside the upheavals of ancient Indian political history, wherein kings and dynasties faced endless threats and challenges from rivals. Enough so that, like all kingdoms, violence against the king became a serious political problem that had to be dealt with ruthlessly and effectively through preemptive action, punishment, and retaliation. The punishment for one who reviles, spreads evil news about the king, or reveals council secrets is punished with tearing out the tongue, as forementioned. More severe crimes against the king and kingdom, however, invite more severe punishments. Death by setting fire to the hands and head is a punishment for one who covets the kingdom, forces entry into the king's harem, attacks the king's palace, aids his enemies, incites forced people or enemies, or causes a rebellion in a fortified city, countryside, or army. The man is restrained, his head and hands doused in sulfur or another flammable, and lit ablaze. Punishment number 5 is blown asunder. This was the advent of British colonialists who tormented India in the 18th and 19th centuries. Blowing from a G word I can't say on YouTube involved the condemned being tied in front of a cannon so that the small of their back was forced against the muzzle. Their arms and legs would be tied behind them, the rope pulled taut enough that it curves their limbs back behind them uncomfortably. The cannon would then be fired, pretty much obliterating the prisoner's abdominal portion and blowing them in half. Bonus points for all the guts raining down on everyone. One contemporary observer reported that a head was blown almost 50 feet in the air once, and limbs sometimes landed 100 yards away, and the rest of the body essentially just vaporized. Punishment number 4 is torn apart. Another colonial classic. This style of death sentence is found everywhere from Rome to medieval Britain to Persia. For those unfamiliar with this punishment, you'd have your 4 limbs tied either between 2 horses, one holding both arm ropes and holding both leg ropes, or it'd be 1 horse for each of your limbs. At the count of 3, all horseback riders would take off in opposite directions and rip the person in the center apart. In ancient India, however, instead of using horses, they used oxen. For example, a law was in place that women caught killing their husbands or family members, killing others by poison, or committing arson are to be torn apart by oxen. Punishment number 3 is cooked alive. The sensation of being boiled alive was an absolutely horrific one, yet it was a punishment for things as meager as theft or lying. A large cauldron was filled with water, oil, tar, fat, or molten lead and left to boil. Putting a victim in the cauldron before the boiling was done was the worst way to exert this punishment, as it meant they would probably remain conscious, and then he'd notice his eyes burning, clothes fusing with his body, and skin blistering. The limbs and extremities were the first things to burn after that. After the person's outer layers began to cook, their organs began to cook as well, and their bodily fluids rose in temperature so they were also boiling inside. All who went through this medieval death could only pray for a fast and merciful one, but boiling to death was unfortunately a very slow process. A quick death would only come, as said, if the liquid was already boiling when the victim is dunked in. If it wasn't and they wanted to speed up their own deaths, the victim could always duck their head underneath the liquid and just boil their own brain that way. But otherwise, it was long and horrific until the very end. While this should have been reserved for only the worst offenders, it soon became a go-to death sentence for foragers of all people. In India, it was said in the Garuda Puranam that the people who didn't offer food to orphans and contaminated food are boiled in oil after their death. In 1606, Guru Arjan of the Sikhs was boiled alive as a form of torment and subsequently died on the orders of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Punishment number 2 is exposure. While this was less common in ancient India, it was part of other punishments such as pillory, whipping posts, or stocks, or it was used as a method of gaining confession. Victims could be exposed to the elements by restraining them somewhere outside, whether on the ground, which was more susceptible to bugs, pests, animals, and grime, or somewhere suspended, like a cage, off a wall. That one was popular in Europe. In summer, the guards could just pour hot water over the victim's head repetitively, which eventually increased body temperatures to the extent that heat stroke would take effect, causing a victim to die slowly and painfully. Sometimes the body was even left to decay publicly to dissuade any further crimes. During cold days and nights, the chill, as well as the lack of protection from the wind, could easily sap a victim's body heat. Alternatively, the victim could be buried up to his neck, letting any animals, insects, or other people kill him slowly the way they want to. Due to its cost efficiency and cruelty, the exposure torment strategy was widespread in medieval Europe and many other places. In many cases, the victim was sentenced to a short period of exposure depending on the crime. However, death was frequent since they were completely defenseless, even if it wasn't intended to be more than a 2-day punishment. You never know. Punishment number 1 is immurement. However, it is more identifiable to the common person if I just call it being buried alive. Placing someone into a confined space and then sealing it up so they're forced to wait for their own death, whether it comes from dehydration, starvation, or even asphyxiation. Immurement also had been performed for aesthetic reasons in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, and examples can be found in plenty of written sources. The year is 1660 and the place is India. On the 6th of May, Shah Shuja, the second son of the Mughal emperor, boarded a ship and sailed from Dhaka to Arakan to find asylum from his brother, who was now his father's successor and wanted to kill him. Shah's plan was to stay in Arakan for a short period before sailing over to Mecca, then Persia. But he landed there just as the monsoon season hit, and it trapped the prince in Arakan for many months. And then for life. See, while stuck there, the king asked Shah if his eldest daughter would marry his son. For some reason, this really grilled Shah's onions, and he tried to overthrow the Arakan king in a coup, which then was found out. Although Shah managed to escape into the jungle, he was subsequently caught and put to death. The prince's family, however, were thrown into prison after their capture, although they were set free later. Moreover, the king married Shah's eldest daughter himself. He didn't even give her to his son, really just spit on dad's grave like that. It seems like the surviving family members of Shah, including that eldest daughter, plotted to seize power again and overthrow the king, having clearly learned nothing. Like the last time the conspiracy was leaked, and this time the king meant business. If his family was going to keep being a problem, he was just going to exterminate the entire thing. According to the 17th century French physician and traveler Francois Bernard, the men were decapitated with axes, whilst the women were closed, confined in their apartments, left to die of hunger. All the windows and doors had been sealed. Even Shah's eldest daughter, now the king's wife, was not spared. Imagine living somewhere where you could literally be asked, hey, could you die over there, please? Called Prohibition of Death laws. They've shown up through history and around the world, and some argue that not much action is taken to enforce or punish violators, but that's because it'd be kinda hard, right? Well, this is the island of Delos, considered a holy site by the ancient Greeks. You can see many of the old temples and statues that were erected in worship of the gods there. Check her out, she's a beaut, Clark. Classic architecture, clear teal waters, and dream vacay. No better place than to die. Until the 6th century BC, when a whack-job tyrant named Pisistratus ordered all of his soldiers, serfs, workers, whatever, to remove every dead body from the island as they had rendered it impure. Shovels in hands, they really did remove the dead bodies one by one until they felt they were all gone. I doubt you can actually remove all the dead bodies from any piece of land, but I imagine they probably got pretty damn close. And from there it became law in the Greek kingdom that it was illegal to die on the island of Delos. I guess if you drop dead, they just like leave a fine on your body, tuck it in your belt loop maybe, all saucy like, who knows. This wasn't the only place this happened though. Check out the coastal town of Le Lavador, France. Sheesh, what is up with not being able to die in luxury? This is nice! Anyways, due to the disputes over the crowded cemeteries, ordinances to build new cemeteries, and conflicts with local environmentalists, the mayor just tossed his hands up and said, you know what? If nobody can share, nobody gets any, and passed a law forbidding residents from dying. See guys, this is why we use our words and our listening ears. For everyone who makes fun of people's height, just know the courts will favor a short king. You should never make fun of someone for something they can't control, and height is a big one. Men especially face a lot of scrutiny and rejection for it, and we're at a point where nowadays, if you're literally 5'8", people will say you're short. Gentlemen, that is not the case. So, if you've ever been called short, listen to this. According to the 18 Laws of Qin, a set of legal codes written on bamboo slips that were unearthed in the Hubei province in 1975, during the Qin dynasty of China, there was a law stipulating that men and women shorter than the height 1.52 meters do not have to bear any criminal responsibility for any crimes they committed. Apparently, This was because the household registration system, known as hukoi today, was incomplete at the time, so it was often impossible to verify a person's age. So the government used height. The founder of the Qin dynasty himself, Qin Shi Huang, apparently only reached 1.5 meters tall, that's 5 feet, when he was 22. So he allegedly believed that his subjects could only be defined as adults once they grew taller than that. So yeah, short kings prevail. Nothing is more freaky than government-mandated furry costume. Europe really tried just about anything in the way of public shaming to air out someone's criminal history. Unlike China or Japan, which literally tattooed faces, the Ottomans who cut off hands, or even their European ancestors who chopped off noses and ears, the 17th and 18th century Europeans took a new tactic: shame masks. The uncomfortable apparel was made out of solid metal and would have been painful and super heavy when strapped tightly to your face. Naturally, it's abrasive, it's rusty, it's riddled with tetanus. But don't worry, there are lots of cool styles, like these jaunty pagan god looking dudes. As mentioned, there are these weird animal heads like medieval furry getup. This one's a rooster, and apparently, to quote, those who were, well, the other name for a rooster, swaggering and vainglorious, would be forced to wear a rooster mask for hours, even a day. Which may not sound that bad, but again, chafy, hot, heavy cast iron, the pressure of which is on your scalp and your collarbones. And apart from these terrifying masks, criminals were given humiliating badges they had to wear for, yeah, rest of their life. Next up, we got the M&M's trial by ordeals, and by M&M I mean medieval and Mesopotamia, not the M&M candy franchise out here trialing people by fire. And while I may be joking around, these trials were no joke. If you stole a bunch of crap and you were caught, they just hang you, no questions asked. But when ordeals are deemed appropriate for the crime committed, well, they weren't effing around. You were about to go through the holy test ringer, and your punishment if failed was excommunication from the church, because God clearly didn't believe in your good name. Kinda like a Mean Girls Regina George burn book. But that was just the beginning. There were 3 types of ordeals for medieval Europe: being tossed in cold water, and if you think you're innocent, float you're guilty, makes sense. Hot water ordeal requires you to pick a stone from boiling water and heal from those burns in 3 days if you want to be innocent. And finally, hot iron, because being able to carry a pound of boiling iron meant you were righteous. Did literally anyone pass that? Meanwhile, trial and ordeal in Mesopotamia allowed the gods to decide criminal accusations, in which case I hope they all learned how to float or swim young, because God came in the form of a rapid river. The law goes as follows: if anyone bring an accusation against a man, the accused go to the river and leaps in the river. If he sinks in the river, his accused shall take possession of his house. But if the river proves that the accused is not guilty and he escapes unhurt, then he who has brought the accusation shall be put to death, and the guy who jumped in the river gets to take the house of the accuser, whatever. So what I'm hearing is, welcome everyone to Mesopotamia's favorite game show, Drown or Win a House, where contestants go before the court, their gods, and one rapid river to face off the ultimate test. Are they innocent or guilty? And now for a punishment I don't even want to know how they discovered: tickly lickly torture. Some names are misleading and others are quite on the nose. This is a beautiful middle ground of both. So the victims are laid out in front of a goat, their feet are covered in salt water. Goats love the salt and they love sodium, so they lick and lick and lick at the sole of his foot. And fun fact for you guys who aren't out here feeling goat tongues up often or haven't eaten manish water, they're pretty much like giant cat tongues. So rough that once the skin is pruny from a couple batches of the salt water and goat spit, the abrasive tongue will literally rip layers of skin off the foot. There's been cases of this method going so far that goat licked to expose the bones. The punishment was only ever rumored to be used in medieval France, and it's only ever described in a 1502 Italian document.